I'm back out on site with Shoreline Builders. We have our harbor project out here where, you can see we have that beautiful view of the water. But today we're going to talk about wall framing, and I'm just going to run through some basics of, I know it's funny, talking about the basics, I get it. But we're going to talk about some of the basics of wall framing. So obviously, all of our frames, we have 2x6 studs. In this case here, we have a 16-inch on-center framing. We're in close proximity to the water here, so we have a lot of issues with wind, the wind zone that we're in. So sometimes we don't go to that 24-inch on-center. We dial it back to that 16-inch on-center to get that strength and meet those requirements for the wind zone. And we work closely with our structural engineer to come up with those decisions. But anyways, today we're talking more about the nomenclature, the parts and pieces that make up a wall frame. So here we have basically our common stud, right? Common stud goes from bottom plate to double top plate. In this case, they're 16 inches on center. You see that we have intermediate blocking here. Well, the intermediate blocking is to capture this shear panel here and then capture the shear panel above. So we actually have a joint in here. So the blocking is basically to complete the shear plane of each of these panels. So we have the ability to nail into that blocking, and then the blocking transfers it to the stud frame coupled with the mudsill and bottom plate. That's what makes up the shear wall. As we move across the wall, we have a couple other pieces. So this is called the king stud. The king stud is nothing more than a common stud, but the king stud kind of ends the window framing. You see alongside it, we have what we call the jack. Some people choose to call it the trimmer, but the reason it's called the jack is because it jacks up the header. So the header is the piece of structure that goes across the top of the window that the floor frame then comes in. The header distributes it to the side. The jack and the king take that load down to the foundation. As we move across the window, we have the rough sill. The rough sill is supported by cripples. The cripples maintain that stud spacing. So as we apply that sheathing on the outside for shear, we're staying on that 16-inch grid, but also on the inside, we're capturing that 16-inch grid with the drywall on the inside. You can see here we have the cripples on the end that help support that sill, and then we just have our common cripple here that's falling on that dimension. We have a couple trimmers in the middle of the windows here because we chose to separate these windows. Those go up and they support that header, and then on this side we have the jack and the king again. Let's talk a little bit about the header. If you notice the header there, we develop a little pocket. On a lot of my projects, I like to just size an appropriate LVL, use that, push that up against the double top plate, and then put what I call a head plate on it, which is the 2x6 on the flat. And what that does is that then creates a pocket. I know a lot of framers like to put rigid insulation in and do built up headers, and I did those for years, but then I came up with the idea of let's just create a header pocket. The beauty of the header pocket is that the framers do what the framers do when the framers do it, and the insulator gets to do what the insulator does when it's time for him to do his job. So it doesn't pull anybody out of sequence. It doesn't ask anybody to play with materials that they're not familiar with. Framers are framing, insulators are insulating. And they're insulating that pocket just like they're insulating the standard cavity of the wall frame. So anyways, let's go back to the studio. I'll pull up some drawings and we'll talk a little bit more about wall framing. We'll see you there. Hey everybody. Welcome back to the studio. Hopefully you enjoyed that little trip out to the job site. Shoreline Builders doing a great job on that project. Love working with those guys. Like I said before, been with them for, a little over 30 years. So got quite the relationship going. Great team with those guys. Anyways, wall framing. I broke out generic wall frame, and we're just going to talk through some of the basics. We'll talk about the pieces there and what's happening with the wall. So, of course, Big Red is here, and he's going to lay down some marker for us and help us to understand this. So let's dive in. All right. So you can see here, this isn't a detail from a specific house. It's just a typical wall frame that I had done to illustrate things about the wall frame. So when we were out there, remember we talked about some different components. When you have, say, windows, you have the jack stud. The jack stud runs down the side inside the king stud. And the reason it's called the jack stud is because it jacks up the header. And you have the sill. And we don't have any under there because of the way that fell, but occasionally you'll have a cripple stud. So you can see here, king, jack. There's actually a cripple along the sideline there. Cripple, a jack, and a king. And then the header. So those are your basic components of the around the window frame. Then you have your common stud. You can see that there, marked with an S. And then, of course, we have the bottom plate, and we have the top plate that ties it all together. Couple things about the wall system. You can see this one here is laid out on a 2-foot on center. So typically you lay them out 2 feet on center or 16 inches on center, which was the one we had out in the field. 2 foot. A lot of times people will refer to that as advanced framing. I don't know why it's advanced, but we'll run with it because that's what people call it. Or value engineered framing. But basically all they're doing is just trying to whittle away at how much wood gets placed on the wall. Now, why would you want to do that? So if we took a typical section of wall like this, and I told you before, I've done this many a times where I've drawn all the exterior wall framing for a house and then counted up studs. So there's basically 3 primary areas to a wall frame, right? There is the window and door area. There's what I call the opaque area, which is nothing more than the framing. And number 3 is the cavity area. Now, what's really interesting is, you have that cavity area, let's say here, for example. Right? Whenever somebody refers to a wall and its R value, they always refer to center of cavity. Now, I don't know why that convention, but I guess it's the one that makes your wall sound good. So in a 2x6 wall, usually that's somewhere around R21-ish. Right, and we can play with that number based on different insulation levels, but that's a pretty sound estimate, that R21. But the thing to note is that there's 3 pieces to the wall, and that R21 is just the cavity. So if we looked at the opaque area, well, everywhere I have a stud for that 1.5 inches, right? All these kings, these jacks, well, everywhere I have that stud, it's a 2x6 made of wood, and we're probably looking at like R5.8 or so for that. Now, where we have windows, depending on what windows we use, if we're using a double glazed window, we're probably somewhere around R3. If we're using a triple glazed window, then we're probably somewhere in the R5 to 7 range. So that almost doubles it by getting that 3rd pane of glass.
But the thing that's really interesting is that if we take these numbers, the R21-ish, R5.8357, and then we apply them to the different components in the wall, window, door, opaque, framing, and cavity, then you get a better understanding of what's happening in the wall. So in a typical house, the window door frame is probably somewhere around 20% of the wall. The opaque area and framing, I mean, that's probably somewhere in maybe the 18 to 20% also. And that leaves the cavity to be somewhere around 60%-ish, maybe a little more. Those numbers fluctuate, depends on the framer, depends on the complexity of the house, a whole bunch of things. But those are pretty solid numbers, let's say. But if we move to advanced framing, well, advanced framing doesn't have an effect on the windows and doors, really, because the amount of glass and door in the wall didn't really change because we did advanced framing. But where it does make a difference is this opaque framing versus cavity. So that 18 to 20, when we do advanced framing, it comes down to maybe something like 12%. So that 8% now gets bumped up here, so the cavity now moves to 68%. So it does help out the wall, but the important thing to understand is that when I call out the center cavity R21, and I realize that that's only good for somewhere between 60 and 68% of the wall, well, I have a bunch of things bringing it down, right? Because that opaque area, that's somewhere between 12 and 20%, well, that's only R5.8, which is, a quarter, a little better than a quarter of that number. This 20% here is somewhere in the R3 to 5.7. So while we cite the R value of the wall as being, center of cavity, well, there's this thing called whole wall R value. And when you take these numbers here and you take their averages based on their percentage and their R value, then what you get is this R21 probably starts looking more like R11/12, somewhere in that range. So it's about maybe just a hair better than half of what you claim the wall to be. So we tend to want to place a lot of stock in R value, but the reality is that a lot of our wall is not where the insulation is. So we can sit there and brag about our R40 walls, our even here 21 walls, R30 walls, but the reality is their whole wall R value is probably somewhere in the range of 55 to 65% of the number of the center of cavity there, until we get into insulating sheathing, and we'll have some videos coming up where we talk about that. But this is just kind of wall framing 101, and running through the numbers and getting an understanding of what we're looking at when we look at the wall. So anyways, quick summary, right? Typically center of cavity, that's what we cite as the R value of the wall, but the reality is that the wall actually has three components to it: windows and doors, the opaque framing area, and the cavity area. Cavity area only making up 60 to 68%, so that other 32 to 40% are numbers down in the 5 or less range, possibly 6, but they bring that average down so that our whole wall R value, when figured out, comes out to that R11, R12. Anyways, that's it for Wall framing 101. All right. Big red with a little ink on the paper. So that's it for wall framing. It is one of the most interesting topics that we come across in the building industry. I know you found it just as exciting as I did. Anyways, if you're looking for more, you can find me on the Build Show Network right here, throwing up videos regularly for you, the viewer, to watch, enjoy, and possibly learn a few things. Anyways, looking for more from me, find me on Instagram, Steve Basic Architect, and you can find me on the Unbuild It podcast, where I team up with good friends Jake Bruton, also a contributor on the Build Show, and good friend Peter Yost, where we talk everything building industry. Those get dropped every other week, and definitely can learn something there. We got quite a few years of experience there. Pete just definitely ups our average. So anyways, that's everything. Wall framing. Live it. Love it. Be passionate about it. I am. Until next time, Steve Basic from the Build Show. Long live our buildings.